In 1989, Nissan built a car specifically designed to destroy everything else on a racetrack. Twin-turbo, all-wheel drive, 6 individual throttle bodies. It looked like a 4-door sedan your accountant might drive. It drove like a guided missile. And when they shipped it to Australia to race against the best touring cars on the planet, it did something nobody expected. It did not just win. It ended an entire racing category, permanently. The late 1980s were a golden era for touring car racing, not just in Australia, everywhere. The FIA's Group A regulations had created one of the most exciting formats in motorsport history. The rules were deceptively simple. Take a production car, modify it within strict limits, race it. The critical catch was that manufacturers had to build and sell a minimum number of road cars with those same modifications before they could use them on a race car. Want a bigger turbo on your race car? You had to sell that turbo to the public first. Want a reinforced engine block? Homologate it. Build 500 road versions. Then you can race it. This created an engineering arms race that produced some of the most iconic performance cars ever made. The Ford Sierra Cosworth RS 500, the BMW M3 Evolution, the Holden Commodore Group A. These were not just race cars with number plates. They were weapons disguised as family transport, and nowhere on earth was this war fought harder than in Australia. Group A touring car racing was more than a sport down under. It was a tribal conflict. Ford versus Holden, blue versus red. Families were genuinely divided over it, friendships strained, marriages tested, pub arguments settled with fists. The Bathurst 1000, held every October at the Mount Panorama Circuit in New South Wales, was the Super Bowl World Series and FA Cup final rolled into one weekend. The 6.2-kilometer track climbed over a mountain through blind corners at terrifying speed, dropped through a series of switchbacks that would make a rally driver nervous, and fed onto Conrod Strait, where cars would hit close to 300 kilometers per hour with nothing but a concrete wall between them and the next life. It was a temple, and Ford and Holden were the only gods allowed inside. By the late 80s, the Ford Sierra Cosworth RS 500 had seized control of the Australian Championship. Dick Johnson, one of the most beloved figures in Australian motorsport history, was campaigning the turbocharged 4-cylinder Sierra with devastating effect. The car was making somewhere north of 600 horsepower in race trim. Holden was fighting back with the Commodore, running a 5-liter V8 that was slower on the straights, but absolutely brutal through the corners in the hands of 9-time Bathurst winner Peter Brock. These two tribes had been going at it for decades. The mere suggestion that a Japanese car could walk in and humiliate both of them was considered laughable, absurd, borderline offensive. We dig into stories like this every week: the machines, the people behind them, the disasters, the breakthroughs. If you are not yet subscribed and this is your kind of thing, now is a good time. All right, let us keep going. So here was Nissan's problem. They had been racing in Australia since 1981 with varying degrees of embarrassment. The Group C Bluebird Turbo was fast, but shattered itself at regular intervals. The DR30 Skyline was competitive, but hopelessly outgunned on power. The HR31 GT-R, introduced in 1988, was a genuine step forward. It ran a 2-liter turbocharged straight-six, producing about 410 horsepower, almost 70 more than the old 4-cylinder Skyline it replaced. Problem was, the Ford Sierra was still making nearly 200 more. The math simply did not work, and the transmission was a catastrophe. At the 1988 Sandown 500, Mark Skaife had built a 30-second lead over Larry Perkins and Denny Hume's Holden Commodore when the differential self-destructed. The second team car, driven by Glenn Seaton, retired on the third lap of the same race with an identical transmission failure. Weeks later at Bathurst, the same gearbox problems struck again. Seaton's car died within seconds of the start. The production-based transmission was simply not strong enough for the kind of power and stress that Australian racing demanded. Nissan needed something fundamentally different, not a refinement, not an evolution. An entirely new weapon, built from scratch, designed from the first bolt to dominate. Back in Japan, a dedicated team led by Chief Engineer Naganori Ito and Chief Experiment Engineer Kozo Watanabe was already working on exactly that. Their brief from Nissan management was as simple as it was ambitious. Build a car that would dominate Group A racing worldwide, not compete, not occasionally win, dominate, completely and permanently. They started with the existing RB20 engine platform from the outgoing Skyline and initially planned a 2.4-liter twin-turbo version designated the RB24DE-TT. Under Group A rules, a turbocharged engine's displacement gets multiplied by 1.7 for classification purposes. That would have placed the car in the 4,000 cubic centimeters class, alongside the Sierras and M3s. The 4,000 cubic centimeters class limited tire width to 10 inches. Nissan's engineers had already decided they wanted all-wheel drive for the kind of corner exit traction that would leave rear-wheel drive cars for dead. But the all-wheel drive system added roughly 100 kilograms to the car's weight, too heavy to be competitive on 10-inch rubber against lighter two-wheel drive machines. So they made a calculated decision that would change the trajectory of motorsport. They bumped the engine displacement to 2.6 liters. This pushed the car up into the 4,500 cubic centimeters class, where the regulations permitted 11-inch wide tires. The extra tire width would compensate for the weight penalty, and then some. More rubber, more contact patch, more grip, more of everything. The engine that emerged from this strategic decision was the RB26DE-TT. And it was not an evolution of the old motor. It was a ground-up rethinking of what a racing engine disguised as a road car engine could be. Nissan read the Group A rulebook like a lawyer reads a contract. Every loophole, every advantage. The RB26 was a 2.6-liter inline six-cylinder with a cast iron block and an aluminum cylinder head. Dual overhead camshafts, 24 valves, 4 per cylinder. Solid valve lifters rather than hydraulic, because hydraulic lifters cannot maintain precise valve timing at sustained high RPM. And here is where it gets genuinely unusual. Instead of one throttle body feeding all 6 cylinders through a common intake manifold, Nissan gave each cylinder its own individual throttle body. 6 throttle bodies on a production road car, 3 sets of 2, Siamese together. 45mm butterflies. That was not normal. That was not even close to normal. The throttle response was instantaneous, pin sharp. The kind of response you normally only experience on a racing motorcycle or a naturally aspirated Formula One engine. When you stabbed the throttle, every cylinder received air at the same moment. No waiting for a plenum to pressurize. No lag in the intake tract. Just immediate. Violent response. Then they added twin turbochargers, not sequential, parallel. One compact Garrett T28 turbo fed the front 3 cylinders. The other fed the rear 3, ceramic turbine wheels. Wastegate controlled at 10 psi from the factory. The engine was officially rated at 276 horsepower at 6,800 revolutions per minute and 260 pound-feet of torque at 4,400 revolutions per minute. That number was a deliberate lie. Every major Japanese manufacturer at the time had a gentleman's agreement to cap advertised power at 280 PS. Nobody wanted to trigger government regulation of performance cars. In reality, the stock RB26 was making well over 300 horsepower. Remove the factory boost restrictor, the electronic leash that kept boost below 14 pounds per square inch, and it would clear 350 without modifying a single internal component. The compression ratio was 8.5 to 1. For context, most naturally aspirated performance engines of the era ran closer to 10 or 11 to 1. That low compression was not a deficiency. It was deliberate engineering headroom. Room for boost, lots and lots of boost. But the road car was just the starting point, the admission ticket to Group A racing. The race version was something else entirely. In Group A specification, the RB26 received a reinforced cylinder block developed with specialist engineering firm Rethinking, thicker cylinder walls, improved water and oil channels to handle sustained high output without cooking itself from the inside. The crankshaft was forged and balanced to a higher specification than standard because the inline-six developed destructive harmonic vibrations between 7,000 and 8,000 revolutions per minute, forged connecting rods, upgraded pistons with oil cooling channels machined under the crowns to prevent thermal distortion under extreme boost pressure, more aggressive camshaft profiles for better high RPM breathing, and critically, steel turbine wheels replacing the factory ceramics, which had a nasty habit of exploding into shrapnel at sustained high boost. Ceramic turbines worked fine for road driving. On a racetrack with 30 pounds per square inch of boost screaming through them lap after lap, they would shatter. Steel solved that problem. In Gibson Motorsport race trim, running close to 30 pounds per square inch through the parallel turbo system, the engines were producing around 600 horsepower. In qualifying specification, with the boost wound even further and engine life measured in minutes rather than hours, over 650, from 2.6 liters. That is over 250 horsepower per liter in the early 1990s. To put that in perspective, a modern Formula One engine produces about 300. The RB26 was operating in rarefied air. The engine sat in front of the most advanced drivetrain ever fitted to a touring car. Nissan called it ATTESA ETS, Advanced Total Traction Engineering System for All-Terrain with Electronic Torque Split. The system used a 16-bit computer that monitored the car's movements 10 times per second. It read wheel speed from all four corners via the ABS wheel speed sensors. It measured lateral and longitudinal G-forces through a 3-axis accelerometer mounted under the center console, and it controlled a hydraulically actuated multi-plate clutch pack inside the transfer case that could vary torque distribution from 0% front and 100% rear all the way to a 50-50 split. The hydraulic pump could build pressure to 250 pounds per square inch almost instantaneously. In normal driving conditions, with no traction loss detected, the GT-R behaved like a pure rear-wheel drive car. Nimble, responsive. The rear end would step out if you provoked it. But the moment the computer detected the rear wheels spinning even 5% faster than the fronts, torque began flowing forward through the transfer case. Not all at once. Proportionally. The harder you pushed, the more it intervened. And it was subtle. So subtle that experienced racing drivers would climb out of the car after a fast session and genuinely ask if they were sure it was four-wheel drive. That was the entire engineering philosophy. You got the agility and tactile feel of rear-wheel drive when grip was plentiful and the traction of all-wheel drive the instant you needed it. No compromise, no lag, no warning light, just physics being managed 10 times a second by a computer that could react faster than any human driver on the planet. The technology had roots in the Porsche 959 Supercars all-wheel drive system, which Nissan had licensed and then significantly advanced for their own application. While the Porsche used a similar philosophy, Nissan's implementation was more responsive and more tunable. Gibson Motorsport took this concept further for racing. They configured 3 selectable modes via a dial on the center console. Mode 0 for standing starts was rear-wheel drive only, maximizing traction off the line. Mode 1 was the balanced race mode. Mode 2, activated when tire grip degraded late in a stint, biased more torque to the front axle. The system was borrowed from the Porsche 959, built under license by Nissan, refined for racing by Gibson. And it was devastating. Fred Gibson was the man who turned this sophisticated Japanese machine into something the factory could not match. Gibson was a veteran of Australian motorsport. He had driven for the Ford Works team. He had taken over Nissan's Australian racing operation in 1986 and renamed it Gibson Motorsport. He knew every corner at Bathurst. He knew how fast Dick Johnson's Sierras were, and he knew immediately that a standard Japanese race-spec GT-R would get destroyed against the best Australian competition. In Japan, Nissan controlled the touring car formula. The GT-R did not need to be fully developed to win. In Australia, against the world's fiercest Group A competition, it needed more. Gibson received 3 complete GT-R shells from Japan, and his crew started tearing them apart. What followed was one of the most comprehensive re-engineering programs in Australian motorsport history. Suspension, wheels, gearbox, clutch, engine management. Everything was reconsidered. When they put the RB26 on their dyno and pushed for more power, the standard cylinder block cracked. Nissan had to cast special reinforced blocks specifically for the Australian program. Gibson replaced the Nismo competition gearbox, which cost $60,000, with a locally designed Hollinger sequential unit. A Nismo competition water pump cost $15,000. All they had changed was the impeller blade profile. Gibson's team performed the identical modification using a stock production pump for a fraction of the price. The bespoke engine management system cost $600,000 per unit to develop. Gibson Motorsport's total season budget for 1992, mostly funded by Winfield Cigarettes, was $5 million Australian dollars. In the context of Australian motorsport, that was staggering. The result was a race car so far ahead of the Japanese factory version that when Mark Skaife drove a Nismo customer car at the 1991 Fuji 500 in Japan, co-driving with the legendary drift king Keiichi Tsuchiya, the difference shocked him. Skaife described the Japanese car as not in the same league. The Australian team had even installed their Hollinger gearbox in the Japanese car to improve it. The Japanese team was so impressed, they attempted to purchase a Gibson-built car outright. Nismo blocked the deal. They could not allow it. The GT-R made its Australian racing debut in mid-1990 at Round 7 of the championship, Malyala Raceway. Skaife was behind the wheel. He qualified third, then stormed to the front and was pulling away from the entire field before a hub failure ended his afternoon. The message was clear, painfully clear. At Oran Park, the season finale, Jim Richards climbed into the GT-R and won outright. He clinched Nissan's first Australian touring car championship. Then came 1991, the year Godzilla truly earned its name. The nickname had been coined 2 years earlier. In the July 1989 issue of Australia's Wheels magazine, their Japanese correspondent Peter Nunn had written that the Japanese called the car Obakemono, the monster. When editor Phil Scott needed a cover line, he wanted something that would sell on newsstands. An obscure Japanese word would confuse readers. What is the most famous Japanese monster? The cover read, Nissan's New Godzilla. The name stuck. And in 1991, the car lived up to every letter. The GT-Rs finished first and second in 6 of the 9 championship rounds. Not once did a Nissan driver fail to reach the podium. Of 425 racing laps across the full season, Nissan led 337 of them. Richards personally led 229. He won his 4th Australian Touring Car Championship. The only driver who managed to beat Godzilla was Tony Longhurst in a BMW M3, pulling off 2 upset victories at Lakeside and Amaru Park. tight technical circuits where the small, lightweight BMW could exploit its agility advantage. Everywhere else, on every fast circuit, the GT-R was untouchable. Then came Bathurst. Scaife wound the boost up for the top 10 qualifying shootout and set the fastest Group A touring car lap ever recorded at Mount Panorama. 2 minutes, 12.63 seconds. Richards and Scaife cruised to victory. 6 hours, 19 minutes, and 14.8 seconds. The fastest Bathurst 1000 in history, a full lap ahead of the defending winners. A privateer GT-R prepared by Gibson finished third. The Ford and Holden establishment was in shock. The Confederation of Australian Motorsport responded the only way regulators know how. They penalized the winner. For 1992, the GT-R's minimum weight was increased by 35 kilograms. A mandatory boost pressure limiting pop-off valve was bolted to the intake manifold and sealed by officials so nobody could tamper with it. Power dropped from around 600 to roughly 470 horsepower. They were trying to hobble Godzilla with ballast and bureaucracy. It did not work. Scaife won the 1992 Australian Touring Car Championship. The GT-Rs kept winning with 130 fewer horsepower because the all-wheel drive system was that good. In wet conditions, no rear-drive car could touch it. The ATTESA system turned rain from a hazard into a tactical advantage. The 1992 Bathurst 1000, October 4th, the most infamous day in Australian motorsport history. Dick Johnson qualified on pole. The race began under threatening skies. On lap 33, Denny Hume, the 1967 Formula One world champion from New Zealand, radioed his BMW M3 team complaining of blurred vision. His yellow car drifted off Conrod Straight, hit the left wall, slid across the track, and stopped. Hume was taken to Bathurst Hospital and pronounced dead. Heart attack at the wheel. He was 56 years old. The race continued. Most people at the circuit did not yet know. Richards and Scaife built a lead of over a minute through the rain. Then, on lap 143, a catastrophic downpour engulfed Mount Panorama. Richards was out on slick tires. Even the GT-R's all-wheel drive could not save him. The car lost grip at the cutting, hit an earth bank, nearly tore off the front wheel. He crawled the wrecked GT-R over the mountain at walking pace. On Conrod Straight, the car slid into a concrete wall and then into the wreckage of a multi-car pileup. Red flag. Under the regulations, results reverted to the last completed lap before the flag. On that lap, Richards and Scaife were still leading. They won, despite crashing, despite the car being towed back on a flatbed truck. Dick Johnson told the cameras he could not believe you could be beaten by a crashed car. The crowd was furious. The podium ceremony erupted. Neil Crompton, third in the second factory GT-R, gave the booing mob the finger. Then Jim Richards stepped forward. Gentleman Jim. 9 Bathurst starts, multiple wins. One of the most respected men in Australian racing. But moments earlier, he had been told his friend Hume was dead. He was grieving, exhausted, and the crowd was chanting obscenities at him. He looked at them and delivered the most famous sentence in Australian motorsport history. I thought Australian race fans had a lot more to go than this. This is bloody disgraceful. I will keep racing, but this is going to remain with me for a long time. You are a pack of arseholes. Beer cans rained onto the podium. Scaife had stuffed his pockets with Tooheys cans to throw back before Richards talked him out of it. Down at ground level, the managing director of Nissan Australia, Leon Daphne, was hitting unruly fans with his wife Kerry's Nissan umbrella. The GT-R was effectively banned after 1992. From January 1st, 1993, turbo-powered cars were excluded from the Australian Championship. A new formula built around 5-liter, naturally aspirated V8s was introduced. This would evolve into what the world knows today as V8 Supercars. The GT-R did not merely lose its eligibility, it killed the entire category. Group A touring car racing in Australia died because of a Japanese sedan with a twin-turbo 6 and electronically managed all-wheel drive. The same fate played out in Japan, where the GT-R won 29 consecutive races from 29 starts in the Japanese Touring Car Championship across 4 seasons. Every single entry, every single victory. The JTCC collapsed under the weight of Nissan's dominance and fractured into new categories. In Britain, Andy Middlehurst took the R32 to consecutive championship titles. At the 1991 Spa 24 Hours in Belgium, a GT-R took overall victory, beating fields of Porsche 911s and BMW M3 Evolutions. The car was not merely successful, it was an extinction-level event for Group A touring car racing worldwide. Gibson Motorsport built 16 GT-R race cars in total. Mark Scaife rolled one at Adelaide, destroying it. 15 survive today. Gibson remains involved with every single one. The engineering quality of that small Australian team working out of a Melbourne workshop was extraordinary by any standard. They built the fastest Group A touring car on the planet. They developed their own engine management, their own suspension solutions, their own gearbox. They took a sophisticated Japanese platform and made it faster than the factory's own engineers could manage. When Nismo engineers visited the Gibson workshop, they struggled to understand how the Australians were extracting so much performance from the same basic package. The Bathurst lap record for Group A touring cars still stands. Mark Scaife, 2 minutes, 14.5 seconds. 1991. Over 30 years later, it remains unbroken. Nobody has beaten it because nobody has been permitted to try. The category no longer exists. The RB26 engine went on to become arguably the most celebrated tuning engine in automotive history. Stock, it made around 300 horsepower. With basic bolt-on modifications, 500. With serious internal work, over 1,000. An Australian outfit called Matuox Racing eventually pushed an R32 through the quarter mile in 6.47 seconds at 354 kilometers per hour from a 2.6-liter engine. Only 100 R32 GT-Rs were officially sold in Australia as road cars, priced at $110,000 each. They were painfully slow to move off dealer lots. Today, clean Australian delivered examples are worth many times what they cost new. The car that Australians booed off the podium became one of the most coveted collector machines on the continent. The ATTESA ETS system, meanwhile, became the template for every intelligent all-wheel drive performance system that followed. Every manufacturer building a high-performance all-wheel drive car today owes something to what Nissan's engineers figured out in the late 1980s. 10 years after the infamous podium speech, in 2002, Jim Richards and Mark Scaife won the Bathurst 1000 together again, this time driving a Holden Commodore for the Holden racing team. When Richards took the microphone, he smiled at the crowd and called them a pack of lovely, lovely people. Fans at the 1993 Bathurst had been spotted wearing T-shirts that read, "I am an arsehole," Jim Richards told me. The man they booed became part of the folklore. The car they hated became a legend. And the racing category they loved was completely rewritten because a small team operating out of a workshop in Melbourne took a Japanese sedan apart, threw away the overpriced factory parts, rebuilt it with local ingenuity and extraordinary engineering talent, and created the most dominant touring car the world has ever seen. Godzilla did not just win races, it ended eras, it rewrote the rules. And 35 years later, that battered red, white, and blue Nissan is still the benchmark by which every dominant racing car is measured. And that is the story of the Nissan Skyline GT-R R32. The car's so good they literally changed the sport to get rid of it. If you have ever seen one of these in person, or you think I got something wrong, let me know in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.